we are very fortunate to have with us Professor Aditya Mukherjee, who will be speaking on the topic Challenges to the Social Sciences Today. Professor Mukherjee specializes in political economy of development since the 20th century, business history, and contemporary economy and politics. He taught contemporary Indian history at the Center for Historical Studies, JNU, and apart from holding several key positions at JNU, he also served as the Dean of the School of Social Sciences at JNU from 2013 to 2015. Over the years, Professor Mukherjee has been associated with a number of distinguished journals, namely the SAGE series in Modern Indian History, International Journal of Indian Studies, Studies in People's History, amongst many others. His major publications include Imperialism, Nationalism, and the Making of the Indian Capitalist Class, 1927 to 1947, and the famous volume titled India's Struggle for Independence, which he co-authored along with other notable scholars. He has chaired several sessions as well as participated in many conferences throughout the world. His works have been published in several leading academic journals in India as well as in abroad. He regularly writes for leading dailies of India, mostly addressing contemporary issues and current affairs. We look forward with eager anticipation to today's lecture. Without further ado, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. It is indeed a privilege to be able to speak to all of you. I'd like to thank the History Department of Presidency University, particularly Dr. Salim Javed, who invited me to speak here on what I think today is a very important subject. And I'm glad to be speaking to a group of very distinguished faculty and students of one of the best universities in the country. I'm very thankful for this opportunity. I'll be talking mainly about the challenges to the social sciences in the global south. It is not challenges all over the world, but what the global south, what are the peculiar challenges, and particularly India within that. The obvious challenge to the social sciences that all of you can see today is the virtual assault on the various disciplines of the social sciences by primarily communal political forces, which, as you know, don't have the remotest link to any academic discipline. So it's really a political intervention occurring in the social sciences in a manner which is unprecedented. However, before I come back to this issue towards the end of the current assault on the social sciences, we must discuss the issue of the challenges to the social sciences in a much broader framework. This is not the only challenge. This is the current challenge. This is the immediate challenge. But there is also a long-term, wider context in which this challenge is occurring, and we must be sensitive to that. At the outset, one must recognize that the disciplines of the social sciences, particularly history, as the Gulbenkian Commission report on restructuring social sciences, which was published in 1996, it pointed out that the social science disciplines are what it called ideographic disciplines as opposed to nomothetic disciplines. That is, these are disciplines which are given to and in fact should be open to multiple interpretations, as opposed to, let's say, the natural sciences, where the scope for multiple interpretations of physical phenomenon is much, much more limited than, let's say, in the social sciences. Okay. Now, while there are possibilities of multiple interpretations in the social sciences, including in history, these interpretations must occur within certain disciplinary boundaries which are laid down by the rules of the discipline, such as evidence, such as what is called the discourse of proof, logic, and so on. But what we are witnessing is an attack on it outside the boundaries. That is, an attack which is on the social sciences based on lies, on imagination, on mythology, on whatever, the dream you had last night. It has got nothing to do with any discourse of proof and logic of the disciplines. These disciplines, therefore, because of the possibility of their having multiple interpretations, are used both by progressive societal forces as well as by reactionary societal forces. And what we will be concerned with, if it is used for progressive forces, that is, if you used your history and economics and sociology and political science to take humanity towards higher levels of civilization, what is there to complain? Our concern is when these disciplines are used to take you backwards in history, to take you in a reactionary direction. That's what we will look at. To begin with, we'll do an overview of the challenges faced in these disciplines. As an eminent philosopher from Argentina called Enric Dussel, he had once argued that if you look at the European civilization, for example, he says it looks like a tiny little blip. That is, if you look at history of time from the beginning till today, thousands and thousands of years, and you draw a line like this, that is, it is progressing upwards like this, then you will find that European domination is a tiny little blip of 200 years, 19th, 20th centuries. Europe did not dominate in ancient civilization, in medieval civilization. I mean, there are dozens of other civilizations from China, Egypt, Mesopotamia. Nobody argued that Europe dominated the whole world. Europe, in fact, did not dominate the world till the 18th century, when India and China produced, 3 times the GDP of entire Western Europe put together, and India itself produced about 8 times the GDP of UK. So surely till the 18th century, Europe did not dominate. But it did dominate between the 19th and the 20th centuries, when Europe colonizes large parts of the world. The issue is that the social sciences were born in these periods. The modern social sciences of history, geography, political science, psychology, economics, as we know it today, were born in this period. And Enric Dussel argues that in their birth itself, in the period when Europe was the dominant civilization across the world, it carried the imprint of this domination. That is what is in brief called Eurocentrism. So in the birth of the disciplines itself there is an element of this domination. I'll illustrate this with an example. And I often give this example, and I choose this example not from not from one of the worst choices that one can make. That is, I do not choose it from some very poor social scientist, but I choose this example from one of the best. That is, in my opinion, one of the best historians that the world ever produced in recent times was Eric Hobsbawm. You must have heard his name, the one who wrote, among many things, this series of Age of Revolution, Age of Capital, Age of Empire, and then the last volume, The Age of Extremes, the short 20th century. So he is undoubtedly one of the world's most recognized and quoted historian. And when looking at what are the challenges at the social sciences, when I was once asked to speak on the subject, I thought, let me pick up the best work I know and see, is there anything challenging in it? And when I picked up this volume, The Age of Extremes, the short 20th century, what shocked me in the very first few pages was the following, that how Eurocentrism is something which creeps into the best of the scholars. And I will show you later that even Marxism is no inoculation against Eurocentrism. You have to struggle against it. It doesn't happen automatically if you accept this, that, or the other ideology. You have to recognize it and struggle against it. Now, what is the example I want to give you? How Hobsbawm periodizes the world. He talks of the recent modern period. He talks of the long 19th century. That is, he says that historical time is not categorized necessarily in 100-year periods, So the 19th century phenomenon, he says, actually goes on till 1914. And he then talks of the short 20th century. That is, the 20th century phenomenon is from the First World War till about the end of 1980s, till 1990s. And then the 20th century phenomenon, 21st century phenomenon begins. So the 21st century actually begins, the phenomenon begins towards the end of the 20th century, right? So this is how he more or less categorizes. But how does he describe these periods? Let me read out. He says the long 19th century was a period of unbroken material, intellectual, and moral progress. That is improvement in the conditions of civilized life. So he sees it as a huge break in civilization. Moral, intellectual, scientific, material. It is a fantastic period according to him. And then he says, in the short 20th century, the first part from 1914 till the Second World War, 1914 till about 1945, he calls the period of catastrophe, the age of catastrophe. It's a terrible period. And then there is a golden age, according to him, which goes on from about the 50s, post-Second World War, till about the 70s, end of 70s. And then again, there is a catastrophe. The catastrophe is from the 1990s onwards, late 80s, 1990s. When I read this, I realized that if you were not located in London as he was, he passed away unfortunately a few years ago, but you were located in Beijing or in New Delhi or Kolkata, this analysis would look very strange to you. Because the 19th century is not the great century for most of the world. Just take India and China, which populates much more than all of West Europe put together several times. So there's a huge section of humanity lives in just India and China. And if you add the entire rest of the world, it's a huge part of the world. This theory doesn't apply. The 19th century is not the great century. For India and China, for example, the 18th century is a far greater century. And I just gave you the statistics that in the 18th century, India and China produced 3 times the GDP of entire West Europe put together, all the countries of West Europe. This is just India and China, not Asia. Asia did even more than that. All right. The 19th century for the colonial people, which is the vast majority of the world, was the worst century. That was the century which Hobsbawm describes as great in spiritual, moral, intellectual, etc., is the period when India and China, their noses were rubbed on the ground. They were brought to their knees. Their history, their culture, their society, their economy was devastated. So much so that by the beginning of the 20th century, from 3 times, India and China were producing only 1/3 of the GDP of West Europe. It has shrunk. This is what in modern language is now called the Great Divergence, the rise of the West being predicated upon the fall of the rest. So the rise of the West really occurs in this period, 18th, 19th century, in this massive manner. And the decline, the period that he calls the Great Period, is the period of the decline and the decimation of the lives of the peoples of very large parts of the world. Then the period, what he calls a catastrophe, 1914 to 45, is in fact the period when imperialism was in crisis. And all the colonies, most colonies, it has been shown for Latin America by Andre Gunder Frank, it has been shown for India by Bipin Chandra, and it has been shown for Indonesia and so on and so forth, that in this period when imperialism was in crisis, the colonial countries made rapid spurts of growth. In the colonial period, the only period where we see some industrial growth, for example, is precisely in this period, because imperialism was in crisis. What the theory behind this is what is called the loosening of the links theory. once the links with imperialism are loosened, then the colonies surges forward. All right. So what is good for us is, again, he calls a catastrophe. And then he talks about the golden period. And then he talks of again another kind of catastrophe at the end of the 20th century, since the 80s and 90s, precisely the period when the former colonies, from Korea to Indonesia to to Thailand to India to China, are bursting forward. That is, this is the period, as you know, is called the Asian century. If the 19th was European, the 20th was American, the 21st is called the Asian century. So just when the tables are being turned, in a sense, and the colonial countries are scratching their way back into the global high table, is the period he's calling a catastrophe. Now, as I said, he's not pro-imperialist by any stretch of imagination. In fact, we use his writing a lot to critique imperialism. But the mindset, you're looking at the world, at humanity from Europe. It is Eurocentric. I will later give you much more damaging examples of Eurocentric perceptions from otherwise extremely fine scholars at a later stage, because they refer to communalism, which I am going to deal with in the end. Okay. Now, once the colonial countries begin to reassert their economic strength, as I said, it begins to happen from the 70s, actually, in many of the Asian countries. This is called the, when the Asian tigers, as they are called, surge forward, the East Asian countries, Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, etc. And then by the 80s and 90s, 70s to 90s, China and India, in that order, begin to surge forward. All right. Now, the fact that they're now beginning to get their foothold into the global economic high table. China is very much sitting on top of that table. India is still trying to reach that high table of the global economy, but China has reached. Yet, that doesn't mean that they have been allowed space in the intellectual high table. That's what I mean by, the challenge before the social sciences. There is always a time lag. Just as Europe is no longer domination, no longer the dominant economy in the world, but European ideas continue, Eurocentrism continues till today. There is a time lag between that. Similarly, there is a time lag between the colonial countries having acquired some economic strength and those countries also being able to acquire an intellectual position and strength and acceptability, a hegemonic position. It doesn't happen automatically, as I said, unless it is fought for. In fact, as we will see, we still continue to understand our ancient to the modern world with Eurocentric glasses. The fact that merely arriving at the economic high table doesn't bring you to the intellectual high table is seen by the fact that schools of thought still emerge from the West. Countries like India and China, with universities set up thousands of years ago, with Nalanda and what have you, with a long intellectual tradition, don't have schools of thought. When you talk of history, you talk of Cambridge School, you talk of economics, you talk of Chicago School, you talk of Frankfurt School, this school, that school. But where is a school of thought in our country, which is accepted globally? It doesn't happen so easily. The European ideas, which suited the 19th century situation, classical economics, for example, continues to have an impact today. I'll just give you one example to illustrate what I mean, how difficult it is to get rid of it. Ricardo, one of the classical economists, writing in the early 19th century, creates this theory of what is called in economics. I'm giving you examples from different disciplines, not only history. History, of course, you will be hearing a lot about. In economics, for example, Ricardo created this theory of international trade, called theory of comparative advantage, where he said that international trade is best done by countries which produce whatever they produce cheapest. They should produce it and trade it with other countries who produce whatever they produce cheapest. If you do that, there will be optimum allocation of resources. The whole world will benefit. In other words, if India produces rice and wheat cheapest, then we should produce only rice and wheat. And if England produces textiles and machinery and steel cheapest, then they should continue to produce that, and we should exchange this. And if you do that, everybody is hunky-dory. Now, this theory emerges after Britain has industrialized. After Britain has industrialized by forcing India out of the textile market. India was the largest exporter of textiles in the world till the end of the 18th century. So after physically preventing Indian textiles from reaching the world market, and Britain having industrialized, once it's industrialized and is now producing textiles very cheap, that is, you want to pull away the ladder that you yourself used to reach that level. That is protection. And now you say that India should not protect its textile industry or any other industry. It should continue to produce what it produces cheapest. Now, this is a colonial theory which emerges straight out of the first country which has industrialized. But believe you me, this theory of comparative advantage is used till today by people like Professor Tirthankar Roy, for example, by Professor K.N. Chaudhary in the Cambridge Economic History of India. So here is an example of Eurocentrism not dying so easily. Okay, the challenges. This does not mean that the Eurocentric worldview was not challenged. Of course, it was challenged. And the challenge came primarily from the struggle against colonialism. That is, it came from out of politics. It came out of movements that challenged the dominant order. The challenge against European or colonial thinking in economics came, believe you me, first from India in a comprehensive manner. The first comprehensive critique of colonialism emerges in India. People like Dadabhai Naoroji and Rana Dey and G.V. Joshi and the whole what we call the early nationalists, and wrongly called just the moderates, the mendicants. But they were the revolutionaries. They were the people who made the breakthrough decades before Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg. Simultaneously with Marx, they made the breakthrough that colonialism was not the route to modernization, but the overthrow of colonialism was the route to modernization. This was a major intellectual breakthrough that was made in the mid-19th century by the Indian capitalists. In fact, it is an aspect of colonialism or the continuation of Eurocentrism that this contribution of the early nationalists doesn't figure in the global ideological platform as yet, despite, as I said, nearly 50 years of struggle. All right. So the first challenge comes there. In history, the challenge to the European understanding of Indian history is made largely by, again, leaders of the national movement. You have to read Jawaharlal Nehru, you have to read Subhash Bose, the books they write, you have to read Tilak, you have to read Maulana Azad in order to see what is their understanding of Indian history and how it differs from what is the British understanding of Indian history. The academic field at that time, because it was dominated by the colonial state, you do not see very big, except there are exceptions. I mean, there are the Sushobhan Sarkars and there are the KP Jaiswals who were punished for the positions that they took, but very little in the academic sphere. The break in the academic sphere in the social sciences comes after independence with a bit of a time lag. By the 1960s, you see a bursting forward of a critique of the colonial and communal perspectives emerging in the social sciences. This is the period, for example, from Irfan Habib to Bipin Chandra to R.S. Sharma to Satish Chandra to Yogendra Singh, M.N. Srinivas, Randhir Singh, Amartya Sen, Sukhabhai Chakravarti. I'm naming people across the disciplines. This all comes up in the 1960s and 70s. There's a massive inroad which questions, which demolishes colonial stereotypes, colonial understanding of history, society, politics, caste system, etc., etc., etc. Whatever. You know, that the breakthrough comes in the 1960s. But, and there is an effort, one of the most unique efforts in the world, I would say, made by the Indian state in the 1960s to carry this breakthrough to the popular level, to bring it to the school children. The NCERT, the National Council of Education, Research and Training, at that time, on advice from the national, from a council set up by the government of India, decides to persuade the tallest scholars of that time, people like R.S. Sharma, Satish Chandra, Vipin Chandra, etc., Romila Thapar, to write for school children. So Romila Thapar, for example, wrote class 6 books. That is, children of 10, 11 years would be reading those books, right? Now, this is unprecedented. Nowhere else in the world do you see the biggest scholars writing for school children. Some of them write textbooks. Samuelson, the Nobel Prize winner, wrote textbooks which you read at your undergraduate level. But I have not known anywhere in the world that, you know, it's the best scholars writing for school children. So it was a great effort because a lot of undoing needed to be done. 100 years of colonization of our minds had to be undone. And it was felt that it must reach the school children. But the colonial mindset is not so easy to get rid of. Of course, this effort was made in the 1960s, 70s. It had a big impact, but that didn't mean it disappeared. Because, as I said, 100-year-long effort from the times of Macaulay to colonize the minds of the colonial people, a continuous effort was made. And those 100 years are not so easily overthrown simply by politically overthrowing imperialism. In fact, the political overthrow is probably the simplest because you can see the outsider and throw them out. The economic overthrow is the next more difficult thing. What is called the overthrow of neocolonialism, which is what India had to do after independence. When India became independent, 95% of the machinery required to make any investment had to be imported precisely from the first world, from the countries from which you have now become independent. So this is what is typically the neo-colonial situation. You are politically independent, but economically remain dependent on the country on the metropolitan countries, right? And it was Nehru's genius that he was able to break India out of that after independence. I mention Nehru because these days it is a dirty word. You know, you don't mention Nehru; they'll put you in jail if you do that. After economic independence, the most difficult thing is to decolonize the mind. The intellectual domination that colonialism has or Eurocentrism has, as I said, over centuries, you know, and beginning from, you know, Adam Smith and Ricardo. So it's a long domination and it requires a lot of effort. And if you do not keep on the effort, you slide back. And this slide back begins in India from the 1960s. There is a regeneration of the colonial perspective. And as I will show you presently, the colonial and the communal perspectives are married together. You know, there's an umbilical cord link between the two. So therefore, that's why I want to, before I come to the communal, I want to give you the background. This resurgence you begin to see with the writing of, in history, most of you are scholars of history, so you would know, from the writing of Maurice de Morris in the 1960s, for example. He questioned one of the strongest arguments that the Indian nationalists had made, that imperialism led to deindustrialization, that India, the largest industrial country in the world, in fact, Sven Beckert, you know, one of the finest economic historians in the world today in the University of Harvard, describes this period as a period when Britain was doing only industrial espionage from India and China, trying to steal technology on how to make textiles. That is how the textile revolution in England occurs, right? So, there is this decline from that into these countries being nowhere in the industrial market. Now, this is questioned by Maurice de Morris, but in the 60s, there was an immediate response. 3 people immediately wrote long articles critiquing them: Bipin Chandra, Tapan Ray Chaudhary, and a Marxist Japanese scholar called Toru Matsui. All of them have now been put together. Many of you must have seen that volume. So there was resistance. There was a little bit of going back. But it comes right back in the 1980s again with the Cambridge Economic History of India, which scholars like Omio Bagchi and Irfan Habib and Prabhat Patnaik, Utsav Patnaik, etc. have all critiqued very heavily. I don't need to go around. I'm talking of the volume 2 of the Cambridge Economic History, a volume which completely pretends that colonialism existed or that it had any negative effect. Trade does not exist. The whole trade theory just written off. Trade doesn't occur, forced commercialization doesn't occur, and so on and so forth. It's quite an amazing thing. There were critiques, etc. But nevertheless, this resurgence has continued, and now you have, in his own words, Tirthankar Roy's own words, a briefer version of the Cambridge Economic History in the Oxford Economic History that Tirthankar Roy has written, which would make Lord Curzon also, go pink in his face, because he'll be embarrassed. I mean, he'd say, yes, we were very good, but Professor Roy, we were not that good. Because Tirthankar Roy's book, Economic History of India, which I've critiqued at length, argues things that you will be amazed at. I mean, it's a book which should have the title Angrezi Raj Ki Barkatein. That is the greatness of British rule. He denies deindustrialization. He says, in fact, there was positive industrial growth. Not only positive, rapid positive industrial growth in the colonial period. We actually grew rapidly. We grew so rapidly that our economy shrunk. But anyway, that apart, that there was no forced commercialization, there was no indebtedness of the peasantry. In fact, he says that the indebtedness of the peasantry was a sign of the Indian peasants' prosperity. So the Indian peasants who were dying in their millions, remember the Bengal famine, were indebted because they were so prosperous. And where did he get this great idea? This comes from the title of Malcolm Darling's book on Punjab. Malcolm Darling was the governor of Punjab and later the finance member of the government of India, which was called Punjab Peasants in Prosperity and Debt. That Indian peasants get into debt because they have this love for gold and they have marriage feasts and they do, this what was then called conspicuous consumption and all that. Unlike the thrifty Western peasant and so on and so forth. So this kind of writing has not only continued, has come back. So you find a defense of colonialism by Tirthankar Roy. He says, if the British connection, political connection with India had not been made, he says it is inconceivable that many of the developments that occurred in India could have occurred. In other words, colonialism was a necessary condition for India's progress. A kind of link that even Lord Meghnad Desai makes in his recent writings. For them, what was good was the colonial period and then the opening up under the neoliberal 1990s post-economic reform phase. These were the good periods. The bad period, according to both of them, was the Nehruvian period. As Meghnad Desai calls it, these were the wasted years. So post-independence, this entire effort to unstructure colonialism, to grow independently, etc., were the wasted years. This globalization of the colonial period and the globalization after the 1990s was the good thing. Firstly, it's bad economics. The globalization of the colonial period was under colonial hegemony. The opening up of the 19 80s and 90s or 70s onwards that you see in India, China, South Korea, etc., is not under colonial hegemony. It is under hegemony of independent nation states, which are able to utilize the opportunities of globalization for their own benefit, which is a completely different phenomenon. So, but they collapse the two, they conflate the two. But that apart. But the point I'm trying to make is that there is a resurgence of the colonial view, particularly since the countries, the former colonial countries began to do well. Now the argument was that these countries are doing well, India is doing well, China is doing well because they had been colonized. Just as it is often argued that India is a democracy, now we may start having to say was a democracy very soon if things go as the way they are going. They say is because Britain ruled India. I mean, you would be shocked at how many scholars actually argue this, that democracy is a gift of the British, not of the national movement. I'll come to this towards the end of my talk. There is also a postmodernist shift that you see in the social sciences in the second half of the 20th century, particularly the 80s onwards. And that is also destructive of the social sciences. It may be postmodernism, may be very useful for literary criticism, but its usefulness for the social sciences is highly questionable. This whole notion of you're not being able to have any objective generalizations, that each generalization of each person is equally good or each group is equally good, is a status quoist position. It doesn't enable you to make social progress. But equally important, the postmodernists tend to treat nation, nationalism, nation state, etc., to use their language, which I hate to use, as the master narrative. That is, it dominates the smaller narratives. And therefore, they should not be, it is something to be negated. So the postmodernists tend to negate the notion of nation states and nationalism, which were precisely the instruments through which the oppressed countries in the world have managed to bargain their way back into the global high table. So what is being denied is their instrument of getting back onto the high table. There is also the need to distinguish the two kinds of nationalism. All nation and nation states are not the same. Often when even radical people decry nationalism, the nationalism they are decrying is the nationalism which emerges in Europe, which, unless it was checked, ends up with the nationalism of Hitler and Mussolini. The nationalism which was aggrandizing, the nationalism which was homogenizing. As you know, in Europe, nationalism emerged as a homogenizing force. One language, one religion, Catholic France, Protestant England, unification of Germany, unification of Italy on the basis of language. That is, multicultural empires broke down into nation states which were homogeneous, number one. And as the nation states emerged in Europe, simultaneously did they become colonial powers. So their nationalism has at its birth suppression, colonizing, oppression. That's why it's called aggrandizing. Now that is one nationalism. Our nationalism was the opposite. It was not homogenizing. It celebrated diversity. Diversity was not seen as an obstacle. It was seen as an advantage. We defined our nation differently, uniquely at that time. Similarly, our nationalism was liberating. It was fighting domination. So these are two different kinds of nationalism. But if you deny legitimacy to nationalism as a whole, without making this distinction, you actually pave the way, especially when you deny legitimacy to colonial anti-imperialist nationalism. That's where the postmodernists come in, that's where the subalterns come in. once you deny the legitimacy of the kind of nationalism that we saw in India, the national movement, once its legitimacy is denied, what you do is you create the space for the nationalist space to be taken by the communal forces, which is what has happened in India. That is the forces which represent the European view of nationalism, which ended up with the Hitlers and the Mussolinis. This homogeneous, one language, Hindi, Hindu, Hindustan type of nationalism. That is, as I said, that's foreign to India, but by delegitimizing our kind of nationalism, you actually create the space for the arrival of the other kind. This is an important point I would like to come back to later. Perhaps the longest lasting legacy of colonialism has been that the colonized countries were deeply divided on the basis of religion, race, caste, tribe, language, and other identities. Wherever colonialism has gone, Turkey, South Africa, Ireland, the first colony to India, they've left behind a divided people. Ireland till today, split on the basis of a division promoted by colonialism. And India is in the process of yet another split on the basis of a divide promoted by colonialism. Now, this link between colonialism and communalism, this link between colonialism and divide based on identities, on non-economic political identities, that is on primordial identities, on ethnicity, on race, on color, on language, on religion, on caste. Now, these are the legacy left behind by colonialism. And this one reason why it happens, I might allow me to take 2-3 minutes on this, because this is very important and a point that we keep forgetting. You see, you cannot overemphasize the link between colonialism and nationalism. It must be repeatedly brought forward, especially because today, I'm sorry, excuse me, between colonialism and communalism. Especially because today, communalism masquerades as nationalism. Communalism was not nationalist. Communalism was loyalist. It was part of the colonial ideological framework and later part of the colonial political vision. Therefore, one must constantly show the linkage. Now, I'll briefly try to bring out that linkage to you. In the early 19th century, when the liberal imperialist view or the Whig approach or the utilitarians dominated, Britain was talking, their legitimation of colonialism was that colonialism will bring modernization. They were talking of the white man's burden. They were talking of civilizing the colonial people, modernizing the colonial people, etc. And they were even talking in the early 19th century that the colonial people are child people, they're barbaric. This is not my language, this is James Mill. But these barbarians can be trained through education and through our example. We can slowly train them, slowly, very slowly, of course. We can train them into self-government. This was the notion. This notion disappears in the second half of the 19th century, when the third stage of colonialism comes. Because by now, Britain is no longer the only industrialized country. Several countries in the world have industrialized. They are competing now for colonies. There is a scramble for colonies, as you know, from the 1870s onwards, and a desire to keep your existing colonies firmly in your control. This is the time when the governor of Bombay says that Britain has invested in India on the notion that British rule will be humanly speaking, perpetual in India. The notion of permanence of British rule comes in India now. That we cannot leave India. Now, if once you talk of permanent rule, how do you justify it? The legitimation of colonial rule now changes globally. It begins to shift. No longer the argument that you're developing you, we are Mai Baap Sarkar. Because that argument was blown to the skies by our national movement, by our Dadabhai Naorojis, etc. Not only in India, but in England. They went and argued there and demonstrated with books, with articles, with lectures that this is not true. R.C. Dutt, for example, writes 2 books to demonstrate that colonialism is not leading to development, it is leading to poverty. It's worth reading his economic history of India till today. It's certainly more worth reading than Tirthankar Roy's economic history of India. And R.C. Dutt was writing in the beginning of the 20th century, 1900. But since this argument doesn't work anymore, the argument for continuing to stay in the colony increasingly became globally, as I said, till today, that we are there to protect the minorities, that the colonial people are divided people. They are divided on the basis of their primordial identities. They are divided on the basis of religion. They are divided on the basis of caste, or on ethnicity, or on race, or on color, or on language, or whatever. It depends on which country you are occupying. That the imperialist occupation is explained by their protecting some part. Now, the protection of the part is not to enrich the whole or to make the whole more stable, but the protection of the part is to colonize the whole, or to destroy the whole, as happened in Yugoslavia. Imperialist powers all interfered, intervened. Some are protecting the Bosnians, and some are protecting the Croatians, and some are protecting the Serbians and whatnot. And the result was that in Yugoslavia split up into 7 countries. So when we warned that it is this is how the British came, argued for India. They said that we are here now to protect the Muslims. This was the new argument that emerged in the late 19th century. Otherwise, the Hindus, the majority, will overrule the Muslims. That is, the notion of majorities and minorities on the basis of primordial identities is a new idea which is introduced in the 19th century. They argued, therefore, that the Indian people, they not only argued, they worked in the direction of creating a permanent divide. They argued that the Indian people were always divided on the basis of religion. They argued everything else, religion, language, etc. But religion worked the best. That they were always divided. Hindus and Muslims, since the time Islam came to India, were divided. They forgot that Islam came to India when the Prophet was alive, and for centuries after that flourished without any difficulty in this country. But anyway, that apart. So this argument was propagated, and because to legitimize British rule, because we are here to protect, to keep as the referee, to keep the warring factions from killing each other. Now, if you are to stay there as a referee, then the other parties must fight, no? So you have to create, crystallize, propagate, encourage division. And in that task, their greatest ally were the communal forces. Whether it be the Muslim League or the RSS or the Hindu Mahasabha or the later version of the Akalis, or whichever force was willing to become loyalist and go to the British for help, rather than combine with other people of the country, were welcome. So this is the original link of both the notion of Indians being capable of being organized only around religion, that religion is the most important identity, more important than language, more important than culture, more important than economy, polity, etc. If you belong to one religion, then whether you are a super rich 10,000 acre owner, landowner, or whether you are of the same religion but you are a tenant or a peasant, you have the same interest. I mean, it's an absurd idea, but this idea was promoted successfully, as you can see now, that all Hindus have one interest and all Muslims have another interest and all Christians have a third interest, kind of thing. It's a completely communal, false notion which was created and spread at that time, and the instruments were the communalists. And that is something that has survived till today. What do we witness? All right, I think I've taken too much time, so I must now summarize very quickly. What are we witnessing today? Just as I said, that since the after independence, throughout throughout the colonial period, there was a resistance to the colonial and communal idea, resistance by the national movement. They resisted both of them. And to the extent that they were not able to resist the communal idea fully, the country did suffer a partition. But to the extent that India at least remained secular was the amazing success of the national movement of a secular notion. All right. So there was resistance. And as I said, the resistance after independence increased in the 1960s and 70s, etc. And there has been a retreat. What happened simultaneously was, from the 1950s itself, at the ground level, forces like the RSS continued to spread a communal ideology, particularly through their schools and their school network, which was a vicious ideology, poisoning the minds of young children. We've written a book on the subject where we have cited what is written in the RSS books, for example. I can just give you examples. One example is that wherever Muslims go, they go with a sword in one hand, with the Quran in the other, rivers of blood flow, they destroy mosques, they humiliate mothers and sisters, they burn libraries, etc., etc., etc. And so the Muslims, the picture of the Muslim, as you can imagine, is this. The Christians are unreliable, they are anti-national, they continue to be anti-national, they are the cause of the partition of the country, etc. The Buddhist, by propagating non-violence, created cowardice in India, and so on and so forth. So there is this picture created of various groups, which is very, very damaging indeed. And that has grown, as you can see, over time in a big way. What happens in the recent past is that, especially, there is a shift that has occurred in recent times, which is that this process has multiplied manifold, especially once state power came into the hands of the colonial communal forces. Since 2014, for example, it happened in 1999, 2004, when all these NCERT textbooks were attempted to be banned. They deleted passages from it where there were references to the Dalit, or they don't like any references like that in those textbooks. R.S. Sharma's book, for example, and many others. They wanted these scientific textbooks to be removed, written by, as I said, the tallest of our scholars. So this attack started long ago. The attack actually started during the Janata regime. And as you know, the Janata Party had the RSS merge into it. So one of the first times that the RSS came close to state power was in 1977. And the attack on history started from then. But at that time, they were only a minor part. They had to, in fact, leave, split from the Janata Party later, as you know. The next time they were close to power was in 1999-2004, when again the same attempts were made of removing these textbooks. The first time they could not succeed because there was a national furor all over the country, and those books of Ramila Thapar, Bipin Chandra, Satish Chandra remained till 1999-2004, when again a renewed attack was made on them, and they were ultimately removed. Since 2014, this attack has multiplied even more. You can, if you just go back a few weeks, you will find a poster of the ICHR, the Indian Council of Historical Research, celebrating 75 years of independence, in which Nehru's photograph is not there. There are photographs of many nationalist leaders. Nehru's photograph is replaced with, you know who, with Savarkar, a person who begs for mercy from the British in the most humiliating manner. That you are my Baap Sarkar, you must forgive the prodigal son. I will never do this, I will never do that, etc., etc. So he is replaced. He replaces Jawaharlal Nehru, who spent 30 years of his youth fighting the British from 1915 till independence. He's involved in the national movement, and 9 years out of that he is in jail, but doesn't deserve to be mentioned. Instead, Savarkar needs to be mentioned. Now, this colonial view has now started making a comeback, this communal view. But I want to bring to your attention, as I said in the beginning, Salim Saab, do I have some extra time? Or do you want me to finish in the next 10 minutes? You're on silent.
Go ahead, sir. We have enough time.
Okay. I said in the beginning that I'll give you examples of Eurocentrism and colonialism continuing. I gave you Hobsbawm's example. Now I'll give you the example of Perry Anderson. You all have heard of Perry Anderson. You must have read it. He's a necessary reading for any historian, especially if you're reading European history and so on and so forth. Perry Anderson suddenly decided that he must write on India. He has no expertise on India. He's never researched on India. But he writes these two major articles in the London Review of Books in 2012, which was then published as a book called The Indian Ideology by a left-wing publishing group in India. Now, what does Perry Anderson argue? And you'll be amazed. He repeats the entire colonial stereotype. He looks at, he rubbishes every icon of our Indian national movement, from Gandhi to Nehru. Nehru, he says, didn't even know English. Otherwise, why would he say, he didn't know English, he didn't know geography, he knew nothing. Otherwise, why would he make the 1947 speech where he said, the midnight speech where he said that when the world sleeps, India shall awake. He says, didn't he know that the world was not sleeping at that time? That in midnight in India, it's daytime in America. I mean, that kind of, childish stuff that he critiques Nehru for. And Gandhi dismisses as a upper caste bania, who was just doing caste politics, etc. So all the nationalist icons are removed. But the framework he uses to critique Indian nationalism is the colonial one. He, for example, repeats virtually verbatim the understanding that the Indian National Congress, which was, as you know, was the platform of Indian nationalism, in which from communists to Gandhians to liberals, everybody could participate. He dismisses it as being only a upper caste Hindu party. Not only a Hindu party, but an upper caste Hindu party. That is, the Congress, Indian National Congress, did not represent the Indian people. This is Lord Dufferin. His language was, it represents the microscopic minority. This is Cambridge School, that the Congress was only a party of the upper caste Hindus fighting amongst each other for loaves and fishes of imperialism. This is Anil Seal. And this is being said by Perry Anderson. But take it further. He says, universal franchise, this is what is the most damaging. Universal franchise or democracy, he says, was not suitable to India. Because if adult franchise came, if democracy, universal franchise came, then the Hindu majority, the upper caste Hindu majority will suppress the Muslims. This was the British argument. To deny self-government to India, to deny Indian government, Indian national movement's demand for democracy to more democratic space, they denied it on this ground. The same ground is being used. And then he supports the British for moving the separate electorates. As you know, the separate electorates means that the Muslims can only vote for Muslims, the candidate will be Muslim, and the voting will be by Muslims. I mean, separate electorate by definition is the two-nation theory, that the Hindu cannot represent a Muslim, Muslim cannot represent a Hindu. They have separate interests. And it was the key instrument of the British to divide the Indian people. And he defends the separate electorate. And he critiques Gandhi for opposing the separate electorate. As you know, that Gandhi, was willing to, at a later stage, was willing to stake his life on this issue, that no separate electorate, because it would divide the Indian people. Now he critiques that and said separate electorate is necessary. In my critique of Perry Anderson, which I published in an article later, I said that Perry Anderson should have taken a lesson from W.C. Smith, writing in the 1940s, that before you generalize about other societies, please try that idea on your own society. if India must have separate electorates to protect the Hindus and the Muslims and the Sikhs, etc., etc., why should Britain not have separate electorates for the Africans, for the blacks, for the Catholics, for the Hindus, for the Muslims, etc. in England? Don't they have all these people there? No, there you don't need it, because there the notion of, this is Eurocentrism. There the notion of class, nation, wider modern categories is relevant. The Indian people must be categorized only around religion and caste and separate electorates. This is a complete, mix-up and borrowing of the colonial paradigm, which you see in Perry Anderson. And he goes to the extent of saying that the partition of India, what caused the partition of India? Not communalism, not the colonial state, not Hindu communalism and Muslim communalism, not the Savarkar and Jinnah both arguing that Hindus and Muslims represent two different nations. None of that. The partition of India, he says, was caused by the Indian National Congress. Exactly what your communal leaders are now saying, that it is Gandhi and Nehru responsible for the partition of the country. So here you're seeing a left-wing writer. Perry Anderson was the editor of the New Left Review for decades, one of the tall left-wing writers in the world. So I'm giving you these extreme examples to see that how pernicious and deep these colonial ideas go into the minds of people, that unless you struggle against them, they keep coming back at you. Okay, I'll skip a lot of what I wanted to say and come to the last part of what I have to say today. To come to the current situation. We are now faced with what people like Professor Prabhat Patnaik and others have called communal fascist forces. Forces which had nothing to do with the freedom struggle, collaborated with it, as I said, are now in power in the country. The strategy is no longer to communalize the minds of people through school textbooks, etc. I discussed this earlier already, the RSS and all that. It has shifted. Now the strategy is to use state power in the same manner as the British did, to use state power to fill up institutions with your own people, whether it be the judiciary, the press, or the bureaucracy, but even the education system, the UGC, the ICSSR, the ICHR, the NCERT, the National Book Trust, etc. Put in your people, and then use state power to impose a communal viewpoint and suppress brutally any opposition to these views. Suppression can take many features. You can not appoint people who hold a viewpoint. You can dismiss them. You can suspend them. You can not allow them to speak, and so on. But the model that was chosen, that is why people call it communal fascist, was straight out of the fascist textbook. Fascism, when it emerges, its first target is the intelligentsia. People who think, people who ask questions, and therefore the universities. You may all have heard of Peter Drucker. Peter Drucker, this great management guru, was a German in Frankfurt University, and that's when Hitler attacked. And Frankfurt was at that time considered one of the best universities in Germany. And there was a massive attack on Frankfurt, and Peter Drucker had to run for life because he was a Jew, and went off to the United States, and that's where he became eventually a very famous intellectual and management person. The same story of Frankfurt, which he writes, is what you are witnessing here. It started with JNU, the top universities of this country, Calcutta, Jadavpur, AMU, Jamia, Hyderabad, just name it. Universities which have been ranked internationally and by the Indian state itself repeatedly as among the tops. have been attacked in a vicious manner. Fellow travelers are put as the heads of these institutions, and the institutions are demonized. I'll give you the example of JNU, where I've taught for 40 years. JNU was demonized in a manner in 1916 onwards, when they managed to put in their own man as the vice chancellor, in a manner in the public sphere that you read the newspapers of early 1916 and you will see this, that taxi drivers and auto drivers would refuse to take passengers to JNU, saying that we don't go to Pakistan. That is, JNU was described as an institution which was producing terrorists, jihadis, anti-nationals. And this was spread among the people. This attack started with arresting our students for holding independent positions, for just raising slogans, charging them with Section 124A, created in 1870s by the British, to punish people like Tilak, to punish people like Gandhiji. The same thing is being done among intellectuals. Intellectuals picked up and then charged with Section 124A. Faculty, people like Jayati Ghosh, Professor Apurvanand, etc., have been targeted. And leaders, major leaders like Subramanian Swamy, for example, of the BJP, he wrote, and it's reported in the Times of India, he said that JNU should be shut down. And after shutting it down, he said it should be fumigated. These termites, which he called the jihadis that are populating this university, must be removed. All these jihadis, Naxalites, terrorists, etc. And this view was then published in also was expressed in RSS publications earlier. So it is part of a plan to attack universities, attack civil society leaders, people who ask questions. This mathematician who taught in IIT and a lawyer who became a lawyer to fight for the rights of tribals and working class, Sudha Bhardwaj, still in jail. Professor Teltumbe, still in jail. People with professed Gandhian ideas. Harsh Mandar, if you read your newspapers, his house and his offices have been raided just last week. Professor Apurvanand, he was banned. People were banned from listening to his talk, like I am giving you a talk online in a university in Madhya Pradesh, by the SP. The police comes to the university, tells the vice chancellor that you are not going to allow Professor Apurvanand in this conference. Professor Apurvanand is one of the major intellectuals in Delhi, teachers in Delhi University. He said he will not be allowed to speak, but then they could not prevent it because it was an online conference in collaboration with the foreign university, and the foreign university said, we will continue to have it. So once they saw that Apurvanand is going to speak, then they sent a police team to the university and ensured that nobody would sit in their office and listen to that talk. Now look at the mind control. You will not even allow people to hear the opposite or some viewpoint which you do not like. And who were used for this? Stormtroopers. ABVP people went up, complained to the police, and the police took immediate action and said that this will cause disturbance of peace if you listen to. So this is dangerous. This is an attempt to silence people like these. Silence people like Harsh Mandar, Apurvanand. Much worse attempts have also been made. Those who still do not listen, as you know, people like Kalburgi and Dabholkar and Padsare and Gauri Lankesh have paid the ultimate price. I have, in many of my talks, been citing this book by Jason Stanley. He's a philosopher in Yale, where the book is called How Fascism Works. And what he does is he looks at many countries, including the United States, including India, and he looks at what are the trends that emerging fascist forces utilize, so that you recognize them. And I will list out those for you, because I think there's a lot to learn from it. It was brought to my attention first by the first person in India to do award Wapsi. I'm just forgetting her name in a moment. 90-year-old lady, a writer. She first wrote in the newspaper, bringing people's attention to this book. Now, what is this book says? It says that fascist tendencies generally do the following things. First, they create a mythic, idyllic past, that our country had a great past. That the great past is linked with only one community. Like India had a great past, such a great past, as you know, that, as your tallest leader tells you, that we could do plastic surgery in ancient India, put Ganesha's elephant trunk on the face. The governor of your state, Bengal, said that in an engineering fair, he said that Arjuna had a nuclear tipped arrow. So every time Arjun, threw an arrow, there was a nuclear bomb going with it, and so on and so forth. Complete hocus pocus. But we had this great past. But this great past, as you will see, was only linked with the Hindus. So that is number one. The second is, you set up a huge propaganda machinery, which I don't need to tell you about how it has been done, from social media to TV channels to WhatsApp messages, etc. Huge propaganda machinery to create a sense of this great past being threatened. That the majority of the people who have a link with the great past are now threatened by a small group of people. So you create a sense of victimhood among precisely the people who are the majority, who are the dominant. You make them feel victims. As for example, in Germany, the bloodthirsty Jew, they were the ones who were the real problem for Germany, a small little community. So in India, the equivalent is the Muslim. The danger comes from the minority. This great past is being threatened by the minority. Trump tried to do it with the blacks. When the black protest started, he mobilized the white supremacists. That, see, if these people come to power, what will happen to us whites? And he nearly succeeded. A large part of the United States did begin to believe that the blacks were a great threat. So that is the next step. And then you create a sense of fear of that minority. How do you create a fear of a minority? By saying that they are much richer, they are much stronger, they have everything, as you have just been told. All you have to say is Abba Jan and you get your food. So they are the beneficiaries of everything. They multiply. 5 se 25, 4 se 40. Haven't you heard so many leaders say this? Leaders, followers, everybody says this. So our great population advantage, if we are 80% of the population, our meaning the Hindus, will not last, because they will multiply like that, and they're multiplying so fast that very soon they give you dates that by 30 years time Muslims will be the majority in India. Complete lie. Every study, every demographic study that has been done, the best recent one is S.Y. Qureshi, the former election commissioner, has written a whole book on this, blowing this myth of Muslims growing faster. The population growth is a function of education, is a function of health, is a function of women's education. It is not a function of what religion you belong to. But nevertheless, this is felt. The fear is still created, and I think they are using history for this, they are using geography, they are using all the social sciences. The fear is created by saying that Islam believes in pan-Islamism. All the Muslims of the world, so what if in India there are only 10, 12, 15%? How does it matter? All the Muslims of the world will unite and will suppress us Hindus. So you want to create a fear, you can create it any way you like. So the fear of the infiltrators, they'll come into the country. The famous phrase, Ghuspetiyas. Again, the phrase termites. The Ghuspetias will come in and we will identify the termites and remove them one by one is the threat. So create a fear. Add to this fear, and mind you, all of these is nothing peculiar to India. This is all fascist tendencies do that. That's why I'm bringing them to you. Add to this the sexual anxiety. That is, your people, your women are not going to be safe. Because the minority have somehow some strange ability to make your dumb women fall for them. And therefore, you believe it in it so much that you actually pass laws, the love jihad laws, for example. The next is terming those who disagree with the government as anti-national. That is, the state and the government are merged. This is Mussolini. The government is not the Indian nation. Government is not the state. Government is just one government. And in a democracy, it is your duty to question the government. It is the press's duty. It is the judiciary's duty. Everybody's duty to question, to keep it online so that they govern properly. But what they do is they equate the government with the nation. And this is what Mussolini did. And if you question the government, and in Mussolini's case, the government was equal to one person, a tendency we are moving towards. That is, if you question the great leader, then you are anti-national. Straight fascist model. Your Deshdrohi, your Tukde gang, your Lutyens Delhi, your urban Naxalite. There are a whole range of phrases that have been created. Last 2 points on this. So once you've identified the anti-nationals, that is those who question, ask difficult questions, you have to vilify them. So that you create an atmosphere where they can be repressed, imprisoned, expelled, or even murdered. Lastly, and this is very significant, this is what distinguishes fascism from authoritarianism. Stanley calls this that fascist forces create, I'm quoting, a dehumanized segment of the population who carry out the task of repression and extermination. He's referring to the Nazi stormtroopers. That is, you create these bands, groups of people on the streets who will go with a flag, and with the name of maybe one god or the other, will jump on the chests of old people. You must have seen videos. And say Jai this and Jai that. So you create these bands. And as you can see, these bands are now all over the country. These small brands of this Sena or that Sena or this Dal or that Dal with complete freedom and state patronage and almost a sort of hand over their heads that the police will not do anything, go about threatening and beating up people they need to like. The situation, therefore, in academia, not only in the pure academic disciplines, but in the way you think. That's why the social sciences is the instrument through which you analyze society. If you're not allowed to use that instrument, if that instrument itself is blunted, then social change becomes very difficult. Therefore, resistance to this is very important. Since I've given the parallel of fascism, I'm comparing with what happens in fascist societies. One must also learn the parallel of what resistance has there been in fascist societies. What is it that we learn from the history of fascism in Europe? That resistance must be united. Fascist forces must be fought unitedly by all sections who do not represent fascism, whatever their internal differences. It is not a fight between the left and the right. It's a fight between civilization and barbarism. Within civilization, you can have a left-wing view and the right-wing view. But if you make that fight the main fight, then you will not be able to fight the the battle against fascism. Again, learned from Germany. The socialists and the communists would not join hands together because they had their differences. They fought with each other. The result was Hitler could come to power electorally. And there are now other books, very, very important books that have come up, that how fascism can come up through the democratic route. In fact, it always does. Hitler did. You can win election and bring fascism. Election is not the only thing. Majority is not equal to democracy. These questions now need to be raised. What is democracy? Now, if you don't have free universities, if you don't have the freedom to think, freedom to ask questions, how will you even question this notion that what is democracy? Is democracy just a majority? That means once you have a majority, then whatever the majority does is right. So the white American majority can now declare America as a racist state and say that blacks are second-rate citizens. Would that be acceptable? Would that be democracy? Obviously would not. So democracy must be something more than just electoral victories. But these questions need to be raised, and one must keep the spaces where one can think freely, argue freely alive, which Presidency University is doing, which is being prevented in other places. Wherever you have the space, if you do not occupy that space to think freely, to argue freely, to express your opinion, that space will get closed. One major lesson to learn, that we must keep these spaces alive. The other lesson to learn is that don't wait till you yourself is attacked. Freedom is indivisible. If somebody else is being oppressed, if you don't fight for that, against that oppression, your turn is also going to come. You cannot be free just by yourself. Now, this is very important. If something is happening in Kashmir which is wrong, you can't say, yeah, wo to bahut dur hai. Bengal mein to theek hai na. Now, this cannot be. If you do that, then the time will come when your statehood will also go like this. You will also become a union territory and divided into three. And then you can't say, yaar, why did you do this to us? Then we will ask you, what did you do when it happened to somebody else? Now, this is taken from, I'll end with this. I repeat this very often. It's worth repeating. All good things are worth repeating. Let us not only let those who repeat falsehoods have the floor. They go on saying that same lie every time. So let us also say some truths repeatedly. And this is the poem of Martin Niemöller, the German priest, who had played ball with Hitler a little bit, thinking that he will be able to protect his little community, but then realized very soon that that is not going to happen. And Hitler also realized that this fellow is not reliable. So he put him to be killed in the, what is it called? Where the Jews were killed anyway. So he was imprisoned and he was online to be murdered, and just by the skin of the teeth he escaped because the war ended. And after that he participated in this, what is called the Stuttgart Declaration, to ask that what is it we did wrong. One of the questions that was asked was, what did the church do or not do which enabled Hitler to come to power? And then he wrote this very famous poem where he said, first they came for the Jew, and I didn't say anything because I was not a Jew. Then they came for the communists, and I didn't say anything because I was not a communist. Then they came for the trade union worker. I didn't say anything because I was not a trade union worker. So it goes on like that. And then he says, when finally they came for me, there was nobody left to speak up. So the point is, speak up when somebody else also is being oppressed, when somebody else's voice is being shut down. Because if you don't speak up at that time, your voice too would be shut down. You will not be a freer person just because you are a Hindu or you are a this or you are a that. So the necessity of the intelligentsia and I'm speaking to a group of the finest in the country, the necessity of the intelligentsia of intervening, of having their voice and not allowing that voice to be extinguished is important if they are to survive as civilized, modern human beings. Thank you so much. And I'm sorry for taking so long.
Thank you so much, sir. Once again, as usual, since my student days and when I heard your lecture always been thrilling and fascinating, sir. Siza, are you here?
Yes, sir. So thank you so much, sir, for the marvelous lecture. It was an honor hearing you. Okay, so we will now open the floor to questions.
Professor Mridu has raised her hand. Mridu, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Mukherjee. Thank you, and I'm glad you did take the time you did. It's very important to have heard you. I'm going to ask a question with some trepidation because I don't want my question to sound as in being in any way an endorsement or anything of the sort of what this current regime is doing by way of mangling not just the social sciences, the idea of the hard sciences are equally sort of baseless, as you've shown us as well. But my question really, I'm glad you brought up Kashmir. I was struck by some of the words you used. In the earlier part of your lecture, you were talking about our nationalism, and you were referring to the freedom movement, etc. And you suggested that our nationalism was not homogenizing. It celebrated diversity, and that it celebrates, I don't want to talk about it in the past tense, and it celebrates that it's liberating. I would like to take you to Kashmir. What do we do with the fact that there is a people in Kashmir that has for 74 years already now, going on to 75 years, actually resisted that idea that Indian nationalism, the Indian freedom struggle, was their freedom struggle. Certainly it's only in the last 30 years that we've seen a sustained insurgency, which is popularly backed. It's not contrary to what this regime wants us to believe, the manufactured demon of Pakistan or Islamic fundamentalism. This is this is a democratic or at least a popularly backed resistance, and it has and it's producing scholarship that actually very seriously questions the inclusive nature of the nationalism that came with the freedom struggle. So, but again, with the caveat that this is by no means endorsing this current mandate. Thank you, Professor Mukherjee.
Thank you, Mridu. I'm aware of your wonderful work on Kashmir, and good to see you after many years.
Yes, Dublin was last.
That's right. No, of course, you're asking a very important question. And the answer will also, of course, be politically incorrect. But that's part of the game. You see, nation as a category is not something which is given. It does not exist from prehistoric times, as our communalists will tell us, that India was a country, in 8,000 years ago, etc. So there is no such thing. As our nationalist leaders, beginning, Surendra Banerjee actually wrote a book called India, a Nation in the Making. It's a project, it's a view, it's an imagination. So the Indian nationalists imagined a nation which would be inclusive of everybody. Now, that doesn't mean that the moment they imagined it, it became an inclusive country. It was a process, and I could quote you 100 people saying this, from Vivekanand to B.C. Pal to Aurobindo to Tilak to Ranade to Dadabhai Naoroji. In the beginning, they're all saying that, look, we are in the process of making India into a nation. And that process will mean that we have to gradually bring increasing sections, linguistic, regional, class, gender, and that is what happens in the national movement. When the national movement starts, the working class is not in it. But by the 1920s, it is not, they don't have to wait for the communists and the socialists to come in. It's Tilak, Lala Lajpat Rai and C.R. Das, believe you me, who set up the All India Trade Union Congress. The ITUC is set up by them. Because they said, what use is Swaraj if the working class is not in it? Who brings the Kisans in? Gandhiji brings the Kisans in. The Dalits are brought in. The women are brought in. Women are handed the most important part in the non-cooperation